It's like 30 degrees right now and I can't turn on the fan because of you, because I'm so considerate. And as you can see, my hair is literally a nature-made blanket. So if I die of heat stroke mid-video, you guys are just gonna have to forgive me. I've been trying to find the best way to pose with this pile of books for like the past 5 minutes, so I think I'm just gonna give up and get on with it. Welcome friends, fiends, everything in between. My name is Leticia and you're here on my channel to hear me ramble about things, and today we're gonna ramble about my favorite books. So this pile is not actually all of my favorite books, and I will not talk about all of my favorite books in this video. Some very important ones like Frankenstein, for example, are not here. The reason for that is literally because I don't have much time to film this video, unfortunately, but I really wanted to put something like this out already, and imperfectly made is better than perfectly not made, so we're just gonna live with this for a second. My criteria for narrowing down the list was just books that I have physically. God, it's hot. You might be asking yourself, Letty, why do you not have many of your favorite books in physical form? That's a silly question because books are expensive anyway, so sometimes you just don't get to have your beloved books with you. For me particularly, a big reason for that is because I currently live in Germany. I study comparative literature here, so you know my opinions are all perfect and academically refined. I moved here about a little over a year ago, but I lived in Brazil my whole life. Most of my books are still there because books are very heavy, so it's hard to bring them with you in your bag. My collection here is very limited, but I have, by the grace of God, managed to acquire a lot of my favorite books since getting here. One of the biggest things I use to cope with the fact that I'm far away from my family and the country I love is the fact that books are so much cheaper here, so much more accessible, even in English, opposed to in Brazil, where unfortunately literature is quite expensive to acquire. Follow me elsewhere if you've followed me for a while and you're missing a book that you know is a very classic Letty favorite in this list. That's why. I will hopefully make one day a full, like 2 hours long favorites video when I have a little more time, and maybe when I've acquired more of them, brought some back from Brazil. I'm so sorry, by the way, if the light in this video is a little weird. I'm still trying to figure out where to film in this apartment. I only have south and north facing windows, so it's always either too bright or too dark, and it's rough out here, but I'm doing my best. I always say I started writing long before I actually learned to write, because I was already in love with storytelling and I was already making up stories every day, annoying the adults around me. I also started loving to read before I could read, because I have had the privilege of having a father who was in love with literature and made it a big point in my education to pass that love on. My dad owned a bookstore. As I was growing up, I lived in a house with bookshelves with like the rolling ladder from Sleeping Beauty, you know? So I grew up around books. I grew up in a bookstore. It's one of the greatest blessings fate has ever given me, and I'm very thankful for it. My dad studied literature. He was a Portuguese teacher, and I'm currently studying comparative literature, so it's very emotional. Oh, I miss my dad so bad. Oh my god. Don't cry. I cry every time I talk about my parents because I haven't seen them in quite a long time, and it's really rough living far away from your family. But whatever, that's not the point of the video. So, coincidentally, I have put the 3 poetry collections I have here on the top. So let's start with poetry. This pretty little blue book with the golden spade? What? Sprayed edges. I think I'm thinking about my cat because she's sleeping over there. So this is just like a collection of selected poems from John Keats. If you follow me, if you've ever seen anything from me at all, no matter what, even if it was just like one random tweet, you probably know how I feel about John Keats. I think we are soulmates that were unfortunately removed from each other by the thread of time. I adore his poetry. I adore his life story. I wish to one day have the control over language that he did. I wish to one day have the power he had to, in his quest for extreme beauty, not lose the like poignancy of his work. You know, second generation romantic, big focus on language, big focus on beauty, which was criticized even at the time, but I don't think he's ever gratuitous with the beauty of his language. He has a surgeon's control over poetry, which is funny because he studied to be a doctor. Should I just read like a first stanza? I don't know actually what the first poem here is. First poem is actually, I am as brisk as a bottle of whisk, and as nimble as a milliner's thimble. But I want to maybe reuse a little bit of one of my favorites. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet reading. So next up is collected poetry of Emily Dickinson. I have always felt a profound connection with Dickinson, but I had only really read her more famous poems. I had never sat down with a collection with a selected poetry, and I did that. I think this was maybe the first book I read. I didn't read it in full, but it was one of the first books I read this year. This book actually had a negative effect on me in the beginning of this year, because I read it and I was like, why am I writing poetry? Like, why am I doing that? I felt like my poetry was so pointless after reading this, because Dickinson's poetry is so, it's like you read it and it's like, yeah, how did the world survive before she put these things in words? How did we ever communicate as humans? How did we ever understand ourselves before Dickinson was there to help us? Because she has a way of packing so much into a verse. It makes me angry because I know I can never be like this. Like, she manages to just encapsulate the essence of such vast things in like a couplet, and I don't understand how, because I am such in the way of Keats, maybe, if I want to be if I want to flatter myself. I love a long ass poem. I am so verberagic, as you can tell probably. She really had like a chemical skill for dissecting and like diluting things into their purest forms. Wait, diluting isn't the word for that. What's the word for what they do with like vodka? Distilling. Poet, everyone. Yeah, she just distilled human experience and just God. Also, I, as a fellow M-believer, I just feel like she gets me. Look at this. I can, like, she did this with 2 stanzas. I couldn't do this with 50 pages. With a flower. I hide myself within my flower, that wearing on your breast, you, unsuspecting, wear me too, and angels know the rest. I hide myself within my flower, that, fading from your vase, you, unsuspecting, feel for me almost a loneliness. And she's just so romantic. Like, it makes me feel in love with her. Like, this one is In Vain. I won't read the whole thing because it's a little longer, but let's look at these stanzas. Judges, how? For you served heaven, you know, or sought to. I could not. Because you saturated sight, and I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise. And where you lost, I would be, though my name ranked loudest on the heavenly fame. And where you saved, and I condemned to be, where you were not, that self were hell to me. So we must keep apart, you there, I here, with just a door ajar that oceans are, and prayer, and that pale sustenance, despair. I'm sorry, but I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise? Girl, these bitches gay. Okay, now this video is just me reading Emily Dickinson, but since it's summer, I'm gonna read 2 of her like nature poems that I really like. The pedigree of honey does not concern the bee. A clover, any time to him, is aristocracy. I wish I had the self-control to write like that. Like, The bee is not afraid of me, I know the butterfly. The pretty people in the woods receive me cordially. The brooks laugh louder when I come, the breezes madder play. Wherefore, mine eyes, thy silver mists, wherefore, O summer's day? I'm just gonna move on, because if I keep thinking about Dickinson, I'm gonna kill myself. Joking. Poetry collection is Devotions by Mary Oliver. Someone recently asked on my Curious Cat what book, did that rhyme? I think Emily Dickinson just like rubbed off on me. But they asked what book I consider a Bible to me. It's a very complex question with so many answers, which is why I haven't answered to yet. I'm sorry. But I think if I were to answer it in the more literal way, it would be this book. It would be Devotions by Mary Oliver, or would just be like Mary Oliver's work in general, in the sense of like how people, you know, like annotate the Bible and have their favorite verses that they come back to, and it's all very like mantra like you have a verse that you repeat to soothe yourself, to remind yourself how to live life as best as you can. That's how I feel about devotions. I feel like this is a guiding North Star. I feel like it reawakens feelings that I can sometimes lose in day-to-day life. The dull chaos of ordinary experiences, sometimes you can forget that, you know, that joie de vivre that you had as a child, that excitement at the world as if it were always your first day in it. And Mary Oliver always brings me back to it. One of the myriad of reasons to love Mary Oliver for me is the fact that she gives me so much ammunition to debate people who claim that people who criticize like Instagram, or rather today like TikTok sort of poetry, that people who criticize that sort of poetry are just being pretentious, and that they only dislike that poetry because it's accessible and makes poetry accessible to everyone. Mary Oliver is such a good comeback to that, because there is nothing more accessible than Mary Oliver. Her language is extremely simple, the poems are mostly very short, and the themes she discusses, while profound and like emotionally complex, are usually very like ordinary. I think there's anyone who could be intimidated by Mary Oliver's poetry. In fact, I think everyone agrees that it's a very soothing sort of poetry. Just because it's simple, just because it tackles day-to-day themes that everyone can relate to, just because it doesn't engage in any like experiments with crazy poetic formality, doesn't mean that this isn't complex, doesn't mean that this isn't good poetry. The thing that makes those poems that I'm talking about bad isn't the fact that they're simple or accessible, or don't touch on any highbrow philosophical themes. It's because they have no serious commitment to language. I'm gonna try to bring this like back to earth and just read a poem from her that I really like, and I'll talk about why I like it. So this is Franz Marc's Blue Horses. I step into the painting of the 4 blue horses. I am not even surprised that I can do this. One of the horses walks towards me. His blue nose noses me lightly. I put my arm over his blue mane, not holding on, just commingling. He allows me my pleasure. Franz Marc died a young man, shrapnel in his brain. I would rather die than try to explain to the blue horses what war is. They would either faint in horror or simply find it impossible to believe. I do not know how to thank you, Franz Marc. Maybe our world will grow kinder eventually. Maybe the desire to make something beautiful was the peace of God that is inside each of us. Now, all 4 horses have come closer, are bending their faces toward me as if they have secrets to tell. I don't expect them to speak, and they don't. If being so beautiful isn't enough, what could they possibly say? I mean by this is my Bible, because I read it and I feel reconnected with my virtue. And by virtue, I don't mean any sort of weird Christian idea of purity and sinlessness, but rather the opposite, a sort of like what's the word for it? Like a giving into the world, like a sweet shock at the beauty of the world and at the great purity that is inside each of us, not despite our sinfulness, but because of it. Maybe the desire to make something beautiful is the peace of God that is inside each of us. Like, yes, Mary, yes. And then you want to tell me that fucking milk and honey is the same thing as Mary Oliver because the language is simple? Go fuck yourself. And I know Mary Oliver will support me saying go fuck yourself, because I read after she passed away, sadly. Well, I think she lived a very long life, but after she passed away, there was like an article about her and how in real life she didn't have this kind of like Zen vibe that people attribute to her poetry. She was actually like kind of a drama queen, which I love. Was she an Aries? What month was she born? Because I feel like she was an Aries. I think this like, Zen energy people attribute to Mary Oliver's poetry is symptomatic of like a larger issue where we really put human emotions in such small labels. I'm not being eloquent about this, but what I mean is, like, me, for example, I'm someone who has a very specific aesthetic taste, and a lot of it veers very like idyllic, and I put a lot of value in beauty, and because of that, people kind of assume a lot of things about me that are just not true and almost like dehumanize me in a sense. This idea of like, the ethereal girl who doesn't like give into fucking like human desires. Like, someone once sent me a message and they intended it as a compliment. They were saying like, I could never imagine you in a romantic relationship. I feel like you're above that kind of worldly pleasure. And I was like, why would I ever be above worldly pleasure? I interact with and battle and question and try to accept and try to do my best with the temptations of worldly pleasure every day because I'm human. And that's why I care about beauty. Maybe the desire to make something beautiful is the peace of God that is within each of us. But what I mean is, you view this sort of sanctity in me, this, this elevation above human desire, because I believe of the beauty I try to involve myself with constantly. And that's just such a backwards way of seeing it. Like, you're really understanding it completely wrong. I surround myself with beauty because I am a victim to worldly pleasure. Victim implies it's a bad thing, that's questionable. But because I have a complex relationship with my body and its desires and my soul and its desires, and whether or not those are different things. Here's the word I was looking for before. I am always surrendering to the material world. I do it every day. Sometimes it's a positive thing and sometimes it's a negative thing where I don't have the discipline to do what's best for myself because of my hedonistic tendencies. But the beauty around me doesn't come from this, again, sort of Christian idea of purity. It comes from Mary Oliver's idea of beauty. This childlike wonder at the world around you and at yourself and your ability to communicate with the world around you, and all of what this relationship can give you. Okay, probably as a result of my incoming heat stroke, I was finding it very hard to explain this succinctly and eloquently, but basically what I meant to say right at the beginning was that people project a sort of sanctity and elevation and purity on me as, I believe, a consequence of the beauty they see surrounding me. Not very eloquent for now either. But that beauty is material pleasure, is exploration and interaction with the world. So really, it's material pleasure that is conjuring up this idea of elevation. My point is, beauty and pleasure make us think of sanctity, but somehow along the way, we always corrupt it to make it so that those things are oppositional to sanctity when they are the ones that conjured it up in the first place. And I got so excited and now I'm hot and my hair is very heavy. What I was gonna do was I was gonna tell you why this poem is good and why like Milk and Honey is bad. Milk and Honey really has gotten a glow up because so much bad poetry has come out since that it makes it look really good. But again, this poem is extremely simple. The form, extremely simple, vocabulary, I think a middle schooler could easily understand all of this. It doesn't do any fancy twists and turns like Keats might do, you know? There's none of that in here. Because I really believe poetry is about a commitment to making language do as much as it can. I once saw someone say, maybe it was a quote from somewhere, but I can't remember now, that poetry is like a novel, like diluted, or like compressed. And although I think it's sometimes a disservice to compare the forms in certain sentences, I like that idea because I also say as someone who writes poetry and prose, whether I will write it well or not is another question. But why are there helicopters flying? Get away from here. You can get away with a weak sentence in prose. In fact, you have to, because if you try to make every sentence in your novel pack a punch, it's gonna end up quite convoluted and like difficult to read. You do not have any page space to waste in a poem. You have to make every single word count, every single syllable count. There is a complexity of thought and a simplicity of language that does not come from a weakness of writing ability, but rather a strength in it, because to write well and simply is a skill. To make easy vocabulary beautiful is a very particular skill, which she is constantly exhibiting. It's a matter of understanding where language can go and how it can serve your idea. I find this poem so good because I resonate so much with the idea behind it, and I think it has a great emotional profoundness to it, but also because I think it sounds good. This sentence especially, Franz Marc died a young man, shrapnel in his brain. So simple, so straightforward, but there's such a rhythm to it. The desire to make something beautiful is the peace of God that is inside each of us. That is, on the vocabulary level, on the sentence construction level, such a simple verse. But there's such an enormous thought behind it that she managed to put into the simple sentence. And that is a skill. With the kind of poetry that I was talking about, it's simple, but somehow wastes so much space, if you know what I mean. I don't really want to bring up any of those poems because most of what I see is from like, not really published poets, but rather like accounts on TikTok, and I don't feel like it's nice to do that. But you know what I'm talking about. Just because it's simple doesn't mean it can't be unique. And I think poetry always has to be unique on a certain level. Because again, what I said, you're pushing language to do as much for you as it can. And with that, you're almost inventing new language. That's why when you read, Dickinson gives me this feeling so much. You read a poem and you feel like it has invented a new feeling in you, or like look, English is my third language, leave me alone. Dug out a feeling in you that you didn't realize you had. Language can invent feelings. It's magic. Poetry is magic. It can materialize things that weren't there before. It can pull things out of thin air, because giving someone language is giving someone power, because through that you can communicate, and through communication, realize your feelings and the complexity of them. And sometimes in order to do that, you need simple language. If I did it, I could have been more eloquent with this whole explanation. I could do a whole video just on Mary Oliver and maybe pull some like Hupikaur, I hope that's how you say her name, poems to compare it to. Again, I don't think she's that bad of a poet. I think she ends up looking really good in comparison to some of the stuff that's come out since. But I do blame her for the popularization, not even among people, but for making like publishing houses think that they should put that kind of stuff out. It makes me heated because I do see poetry as a sort of sacred thing, and I think it's really embarrassing when its name's associated with things that have no commitment to the furthering of like a documentation of human experience, you know? The history of poetry is the history of the human heart, and they keep adding stuff that has no heart in it to this history, and I don't like that. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna read one last Mary Oliver poem because this has gotten extremely long, as I can see up there. This is Sleeping in the Forest. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed, nothing between me and the white fire of the stars, but my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell, as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. Some good fucking food. Okay, I've literally already spoken for an hour. I'm gonna try to maybe be a little faster with the novels that we're going into. I'm starting with another contender for my book Bible. This is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. I really just said these are all novels. No, this is not a novel. This is a collection of short stories. These are all reimaginings of classic fairy tales through a very feminist lens, but specifically focused on sort of bringing up the violent and sexual undercurrents of those classic fairy tales. And when I say that, if I heard someone describe a book like that, I would take a step back. Well, a small step back, because the word fairy tale is enough to always keep me grounded wherever I am. If I'm running away from you, you can scream fairy tale and I'll just stop and look around. But I do really despise the way our culture jests about fairy tales recently. As you can see, I'm kind of an over serious person and I get heated by things that other people might see as very irrelevant. But what's relevant to me is relevant to the world, because I am the world, because I make the world through my perceptions, so shut up. I really hate people who can't be serious about anything. I was thinking about this recently because of a tweet about Romeo and Juliet. None of that really annoying thing that people like to regurgitate to pretend they're intelligent even though they've never even read Shakespeare probably. Where it's like, oh, Romeo and Juliet isn't actually a romance story. Romeo was a pedophile and they dated for like 3 days. And it's like, why can you not take things seriously ever? I think with literature, sometimes you just have to take things seriously and you have to let that story envelop you and you have to take it at face value almost. There is a lot you can say about the perception of Romeo and Juliet as a kind of classic love story because it is so much more complex than that, but I hate this like jokey way people talk about it, like, oh, they were just stupid teenagers. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. Put your heart into it. Let things touch your heart. These 2 kids died because no one would listen to them. And now you're on Twitter okay. Romeo and Juliet isn't here because I don't have a copy of it, and it's actually not one of my favorite Shakespeare's. But the same thing happens with fairy tales. Everyone wants to joke about it, everyone wants to make it crass. I think there's something so unchic about the things people do to fairy tales recently. It's so 2012, so fucking edgy to be like, oh, the princesses are all stupid, or like make things unnecessarily sexual. And that's why I mean, like, the description of this book could turn me off, because you say, oh, we are like bringing the violence and eroticism of fairy tales to the surface. I think a lot of people do that not only badly but unintelligently. That's the thing. A lot of work with fairy tales in modern literature is unintelligent, in my opinion. Very shallow, very base, does not show a profound understanding of the fairy tale. Angela Carter, baby, I am never talking about you when I talk about bad fairy tale retellings. This woman understood the form of the fairy tale. She, I don't know, like I think the brothers Grimm visited her in a dream. Just touches the heart of these stories. She touches the both the fascinations and the fears that fuel these tales. I feel like every time I say tale, it sounds like I'm saying tail, and I'm not sure what the difference is actually now that I'm trying. Tail. As I'm growing older, I'm becoming less scared of my body, and because of that, I'm veering away from my like childhood, teenagerhood interest in Greek mythology into a more like fairy tale tradition interest, like medieval. I've really gone from like classical antiquity to Middle Ages in a lot of my interests. I think that's very interesting because I think in like cultural imaginary, you can really associate classical antiquity with like adult, mature, intellectual pursuits, and the Middle Ages, you know, dark, messy, erotic, like just emotionally confused. So that's like it feels like teenagerhood, almost like the teenagerhood of the world. But I think as a teenager, I was super scared of my body and constantly saw my body not as myself, but something that almost got in the way of becoming myself. As I'm exploring that in my early adulthood, and as I'm becoming more at peace with that, I become more and more interesting in the Middle Ages. I'm not trying to like jump into that stereotype of the Middle Ages, but also I am talking more of like archetypically here. So I used to be really obsessed with that image of the Apollonian temple of marble and straight columns and perfect harmony, and more I see myself retreating back into dark forest, intimate human instincts, like primal desires, and I want to explore that. I think Angela Carter does all of that perfectly here. I think the feminist themes are perfectly explored. I read another poetry collection recently that I read because someone recommended it to me, saying it feels a little like Angela Carter, which was The Doll's Alphabet. I forgot the name of the author now, Julia something, but I'm sorry, but it's The Doll's Alphabet. And that bothered me a lot because I felt the feminist themes were not badly, but a little poorly treated. It was just uninteresting to me because it felt a lot like feminism 101 and literarily not that interestingly discussed. The imagery felt really obvious. Here, there are so many layers to what's being discussed, and it is so much about female sexuality and the fear and fascination with it, but it's all really intelligent, as I said, all really refined. And besides all of that, besides just me finding this so interesting and resonating with it so much on a philosophical level, the prose is delicious, the imagery delicious, exactly up my alley, gothic and magical and just scrumptious. The choice of fairy tales that she retells resonates so much with me. The homonymous short story is the first one, The Bloody Chamber. I think it's more of a novella than a short story, I don't know. It retells Bluebeard, and that's just so perfect. Bluebeard is such an interesting look into patriarchal ideas. But there are also two that retell Beauty and the Beast. Just from looking at me in this situation, you can tell that I watched Beauty and the Beast, like the Disney movie, way too many times. Also such an interesting look into the belly of the patriarchy, like that fairy tale in itself. And I like that she had two versions of them because I feel like those are really like the two sides that I've always been interested in when it comes to that story, and it's such like a measured perspective on it. Beauty and the Beast is another big victim of the unseriousness of the internet, especially, which really makes me mad with the whole, oh, it's Stockholm Syndrome. You do not know how to read. Sorry to tell you this, but if you pick up a fairy tale and the way you read it is in order to diagnose the figures in it with like a modern psychology lens, you do not know how to read. You need to go back to kindergarten. You do not know how to read. You are illiterate. Anyways, I would say that, I don't know if favorite is the right word, but the short story on this that stays with me the most, that I'm literally always thinking about, is The Lady of the House of Love, which is a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, which is another thing I feel like just from looking at me, you can tell this bitch does not play about Sleeping Beauty. Another victim of the seriousness of the internet with the whole, oh, consent, she doesn't have enough lines in the movie. Shut the fuck up. Your brain is not fully functioning. In The Lady of the House of Love, Sleeping Beauty is a vampire, and those two things put together, let it core, like that is definitive for who I am as a person. And that one, I think a lot about sleeping curses as just an archetype. Sleeping curses are like just resonate with me a lot for a lot of personal reasons, just relate to sort of my mental health struggles, but also my relationship to femininity. I read something very interesting. Like, it was Hélène Cixous writing about something Kierkegaard said about the idea of the position of womanhood as always dreaming itself. Like, the woman, it was, the quote was like, the woman dreams love and love dreams her. She is always in second place. Fascinating. So yeah, I just find this brilliant, and this is like top 3 for me. Okay, I'm gonna speak less about this one because I just have less to talk about. It is a little lower on the favorites list among these. Like, I would not really compare these two in relation to how much of my soul they make up, how much of my mind they take up. I really enjoyed this book. I think a lot of the criticism people have for The Secret History is because they're reading it wrong. And I know that's a really easy thing to say and a really kind of easy cope, like, oh, you don't like this book I like because you didn't read it right. But I really do think people read it with the completely wrong sort of glasses on. This book is unserious. This is the one that you can be unserious about. Like, make the jokes about this one. Because this shit is a comedy. People really want this to be a sort of like revolutionary modern Greek tragedy. And it's satirical, it's comical, it's a thriller, it's not a whodunit, but a why-done-it or a how-done-it. It's a perfect like train ride book. And I think it achieves that perfectly. If you somehow haven't heard of The Secret History, it follows a young man called Richard Papin. I say Papin. I know there's a big discourse about how to say his last name. I'm just gonna say it like that. I'm sorry, I don't care. He's from California, from a small, boring town, and he feels extremely unfulfilled until he gives up on studying medicine to go to this liberal arts college in Vermont, which is really like different from what his life has been until this point. While there, he becomes fascinated with this highly exclusive Greek class. Professor is like this kooky guy that the rest of the faculty doesn't like and only accepts a very limited amount of students, and he starts seeing these students around campus and becoming very fascinated with them. When I say it's like satirical and comedic, I'm not trying to like undermine the tragedy and the emotional power of this, because I think that was achieved amazingly. I love the last scene of this book. I think it is so touching, and this is a really haunting book because I'm someone who has a very profound fear of regret and sort of baggage. I talked about this in a vlog, and I don't know if I've already posted it by the time this goes up, but about how I think my fear of aging really is connected to that fear of regret, and this book is kind of all about that, all about bad decisions. This is first-person retrospective, and I love first-person retrospective because of that, because it always haunts me. The idea that the most important thing, the most impactful thing that is ever going to happen to you has happened already, and now all that's left is to kind of find a way to live with that. There's such a thing as the fatal flaw, that showy dark crack running down the middle of a life exists outside literature. I used to think it didn't. Now I think it does. And I think that mine is this: a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. I really like the prose in this. I find it very hard to believe when people say they don't. It's very clean, it's just good. Donna Tartt is just good at writing. You can dislike the plot and you can think like the sort of philosophical background of this is stupid, but the prose eats. A morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. Like, he's so me. Everyone wants to be Henry Winter, everyone wants to be Camilla Macaulay, everyone wants to be the fascinating members of the Greek class. We are all Richard Papin. Papin? Now I'm getting insecure about that. I am obsessed with beauty, and it brings me joy and difficulties in the same measure, and I just really relate to the idea of ruining your life because you're trying to make it as like fascinating and aesthetically pleasing as possible. If you haven't picked this up somehow and you're gonna pick it up because of my recommendation, read it with that perspective, that this doesn't take itself as seriously as people on TikTok do. Next one is another one. I think I would probably say this is the least favorite of this pile. It's not one that I admire as much as others on a literary sense, even though I obviously like it. I think Sally Rooney is a good writer, but it just didn't strike me as much as others did here. The book that just I carry in my heart. It had a big emotional impact on me, and I also think I read it in a very good time. You somehow also have managed to not know about Normal People by Sally Rooney. It's a story about these two people, Marianne and Connell. They're from the same small town in Ireland, and they have very different economical backgrounds, but they go to the same school. and there they have very different social lives. Connell is very popular, very beloved, and Marianne is completely like ostracized. Essentially a romance that follows them from high school into adulthood into their university years. And the difficulties in their relationship. There are a lot of miscommunication, they grow apart, they grow back together, but it has a big focus on how that like socialization in high school, how their different economic backgrounds, and how their gender, like the gender relation, plays into love. And I think it's a really refreshing look into a romance story. A lot of people criticize Sally Rooney, saying that like she just wants to write essays and people don't get why she writes novels instead. This is the only book of hers I read, so my perspective on her is defined by that. I know that her other books are supposed to be kind of very similar to this one in many senses, so I think when you get like the third or fourth book and they're very similar, you start to think like, why are you sort of wasting your time rehashing these ideas? But having only read this one, I think it was an interesting perspective to take on a romance novel, and I think she is very good at character building. I've read the short story that she wrote about these characters. I think before the book came out, like this kind of came out of that, and I think the short story is very good as well and shows her prowess in character building. Also, this is very specific, but there's a whole thing about BDSM in this book, and I think it's a really interesting look into it, and I kind of wish more literary fiction kind of delved into that, because I think it's a really interesting perspective when it comes to love and specifically gender relations. It's a very famous song by a very famous Brazilian singer, very famous in Brazil. I don't know how she is outside of Brazil, Rita Lee. And there's a verse in it that says, "Love is prose, sex is poetry." And I've always loved that verse. And I feel like that's really interesting in the sense that like sex distills and uncomplicates certain things, but does that in a much more like figurative and symbolic way. In that sense of like using BDSM to explore gender relationships, I think it's really interesting because I think fetishes really like expose human desires and like our psychological complexity. So in a way it's like, you know, like the human mind is prose, very expansive and complex and like sometimes a bit confusing and unclear, and like fetishes are poetry, like really distills and makes that compact, but also very in a very symbolic and like indirect manner. So I just think that's really interesting. Fetishes and sexual preferences are a very interesting like path to take into exploring human emotion and human desire. Up is Virginia Woolf's Orlando. I read this a while back. I really want to reread it, but in case you don't know, Orlando is about a young nobleman in Elizabethan era, I think, and you're gonna follow his life all the way to like the Second World War. And somewhere in that time, he becomes a she. And that's never really explained, it just happens. For a book this complex that deals with so much, the thoughts I have to give to you are very simple. I just think it's a really good book. I enjoyed it so much. I think the prose is amazing, especially the exploration of writing and poetry really spoke to me. I really do have to reread this to have like more refined thoughts on it. If you've somehow lived through life without ever hearing about the plot of Dorian Gray, it is about a very beautiful, wealthy, privileged young man called Dorian Gray who has his portrait painted. He's having a conversation with someone while his portrait is painted, and he kind of has a realization that he's going to age and he won't be beautiful forever. And that bothers him so much that he wishes the portrait would age instead of him. And that wish is granted. This is like number one example, fuck around and find out, because he fucked around and he for sure found out. But we're following Dorian Gray through his life, through many years of his life, as he deals with a sort of like consequenceless life. He can do whatever, he can sin as much as he wants. That never affects him, it affects the portrait. Because I think people miss this sometimes. The portrait doesn't just age for him, it takes on the marks of all of his ill deeds. So it's not only that he's always beautiful, it's that he has this like air of innocence about him forever. This absolute lack of consequences really leads Dorian into a very dark path where he just becomes a very cruel individual with no regard for others because he knows no matter what he does, he's gonna get away with it. Besides just being this fascinating and so well done, like existential exploration of beauty and mortality, I think it's just a really interesting portrait of like people who get away with stuff, like beautiful, wealthy, young white men who can do whatever they want and get away scot-free or with a slap on the wrist, and what that does to someone's soul. The Secret History is sort of an interesting companion novel to Dorian Gray, because it is also about a morbid longing for the picturesque. Absolutely delicious prose. All of the beauty that it's talking about is so well communicated just through the prose. It's a book that you want to eat, like you literally want to eat, because it is so delicious. It's also just so biting and funny because that was Oscar Wilde. Unyielding outlook on society, because it's not just Dorian's fault, you know? Like, yeah, he's the one who is doing the fucked up shit, but these people are the ones who are letting him get away with it because he's beautiful and privileged and whatever. As I said, I'm someone who's obsessed with beauty and very scared of mortality, so clearly this just speaks to me. But I think when you are obsessed with beauty in a world where so many dogmas villainize that, it just makes you think about it so much, you know? And I find that Dorian Gray really has such interesting things to say about this. This is like okay, spoiler moment. If you don't know how this ends, get out of here. The crazy thing about the reaction at the time to this book, this idea that this book was evil and immoral, is that really it reads as such a moralizing book. It's almost like a fairy tale, like a fable. It's super moralizing. This man makes a wish for something that is like wrong or unnatural or sinful. Only God is supposed to be able to mess with life and death. Then he suffers so many consequences for it. His life goes to shit. He experiences so much internal torture, and then in the end he kills his best friend. The only person who really cared about him enters like an existential spiral, and he kills himself. Like, he dies because of what he did, which is something that befuddled me for so long, because in the context of the rest of the book, it's strange that it has such a moralizing ending when it talks so much about not being moralizing and about the importance of beauty and about beauty for beauty's sake. And then you have Dorian, who lives for beauty in such a concrete manner, and he has that faith. But the thing is, I really don't think Dorian did live for beauty. We're talking about how, you know, beauty has to be appreciated for itself and not used for any other end. You have the preface, which is such a famous piece of literature and says things like vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. And so then you have a character who is clearly punished for his vice in this, and that kind of feels contradictory. But I think the way Dorian goes about beauty is not the way Oscar Wilde was really trying to portray here. More complex than that, and there's a sort of clean tragedy, like literarily speaking, to the plot of this, which is in itself enough justification for it. You know, beauty for beauty's sake, art for art's sake. You just have to make as best a book as you can, sort of ignoring the moral implications of that, even if the thing you are implying is moralistic, actually. But I don't think Dorian Gray lived for beauty. I think he used beauty as a way to escape his boredom and his fear. He never really just took beauty at face value. Yeah, I need to reread this, but it is just one of the greatest things ever written. And if you haven't read it, you should, because that's crazy, going through life without reading Dorian Gray. Last 3 books, and I think I can kind of do them together, because honestly, this is more just representative of Clarice Lispector's entire work. Clarice Lispector is my favorite author. She's a classic Brazilian modernist writer, and she had the biggest brain that ever brained ever. I just love everything she's ever written. I have reread, I actually don't know if I've read most of her work, now that I think about it. A lot of it were short stories, and I wish I had a short story collection to show you here, because she really excelled at that, but I unfortunately don't have that with me here. It's back in Brazil. I'll specifically talk about Agua Viva because I think it's a very good representation of who Clarice Lispector was as a writer. This is basically like a 100-page prose poem. It's incredibly meandering, incredibly confusing, and it is maybe the greatest thing ever written. Something of a plot. This is basically a letter that a painter is writing, and she's trying to write the way she paints. She's trying to make writing as sort of primal as painting, and it's a lot about creation and being someone who makes things and what that means and why you do it. But you cannot explain what Agua Viva is about, because it's about what it's about. It's about death, and it's about creation, and it's about desire, and it's about mortality and human nature, and also just really random things. Back then was actually often compared to Virginia Woolf, which I think is a fair comparison, but she herself did not actually like. But it's also very different. I think there's something about the language in Lispector which is a lot more, not crude, but like primal than in Virginia Woolf. Stream of consciousness in Woolf has more of a sort of consciousness to it, actually. I do feel that it feels less accurate to the human mind than what Clarice Lispector did. Her prose is beautiful. It has such rhythm to it. I think I've read this book 3 to 5 times, I'm not sure, and I think most of those I just sat down and read the whole thing, which is easy because it's short, but it's just something that you don't feel like there's a place to stop, because this is how human mind is, like it doesn't ever really rest. This is Um Sopro de Vida, and this is Perto do Coração Selvagem. Agua Viva's title is never translated. I believe all of Clarice Lispector's work has been translated into English. Agua Viva's title is never translated because Agua Viva is the Brazilian word, the Portuguese word for jellyfish, but it literally means living water, and no one can really decide which one she meant, and I love that. Also because I'm really into jellyfish, and I feel like that's, if it is the animal, it's such a good title for this book. Jellyfish are like alien and primal, but also so like, I don't know, like magical. And this book, even though Clarice Lispector didn't really write magical realism, and there's never really anything, well, there's Hour of the Star, which is one of her most famous books. It's her last book, and there's something in it that I guess you could call a little magical realism, but not really, like it's just realism basically. But there is a feeling of fantasy and like an esoteric nature to her writing, which is so like just calls to me. This is more of like a coming of age, like almost a Bildungsroman, and this was her first novel, and like she wrote this when, I mean, it was published when she was like 23, and it made such a splash in the Brazilian literary scene and really like already solidified her as one of the greatest to ever write. I love the exploration of cruelty in this and femininity, like those things together. We're following the main character of Joanna from childhood when her father dies way into her adulthood through like romantic relationships, through education, through so much drama. Like this is juicy, but it has a very sort of like airy feeling to it. You almost feel disconnected sometimes, but at the same time you are so profoundly rooted in Joanna's psychology, and there is so much talk about evil and cruelty and like a calling to cruelty in this. I just find that such like an interesting thing to pursue, specifically when you're talking about like a teenage girl and the like sort of expectations for femininity in the sense of, you know, the inherent kindness or motherly instinct of women, which Joanna does not have. And also Sopro de Vida, I'm actually reading this right now. This has a really interesting format. It's just all like a dialogue between an author and the character he's developing. Okay, this video was sort of a mess because it's way too hot and I need to go to work soon, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. And I hope anything I said made sense. I hope also that this isn't gonna end up being an hour long when I edit, because that would be very sad for me. We'll one day make a complete favorites video, and I will hopefully be a little more eloquent and maybe script a little of that instead of just like regurgitating words into you. Regurgitating is the word I want, just vomiting words onto the screen. But I hope you managed to maybe get some recommendations for this, or maybe just an insight into my brain if that's what you wanted. I am now going to turn on the fan because it's very hot. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.